So the issue I'm going to talk about here comes down to some very important issues. Comes down to human rights, comes down to religious tolerance, it comes down to honesty and political correctness. All of these things come into this situation. I read a report a few days ago, horrible case, an elderly Christian woman. Some reports put her in her mid 60s, some say she was in her early 70s. But whatever the case, an elderly woman, an older woman, was forced to strip naked and walk through the main street of a village in rural Egypt, south of Cairo. And the reasoning for this, so called, was that her son had eloped with a Muslim girl. He was a Coptic Christian and had eloped with a Muslim girl. He had fled the village for his life, basically. Um, well, the reports, and I've looked at numerous reports on this, so this isn't something that's been made up by a far right group. I've looked at numerous reports, and they suggest that a mob of 300 Muslim men basically forced this woman to do this degrading, horrible thing, which I imagine will traumatize her for the rest of her life. Um, Shamefully, the police done next to nothing. Now, I want to speak a little bit about the context in Egypt just briefly. Then I want to talk about why, or the obvious fact that this is a very, very common problem across Muslim countries. That's a fact. By Muslim countries, I'm talking about Islamic-majority countries, as if that wasn't obvious. Egypt is roughly 90% Muslim, 10% Christian, Coptic Christian. It's probably a small Jewish population as well, but I'm not sure about that. But anyway, 10% Coptic Christian. Um, Following the unrest of the Egyptian Revolution, especially with the rise of Mohammed Morsi, there was deep concerns, understandably, among the Christian minority they would then be persecuted. And there have been Islamist attacks on Christians in Egypt. There have been cases of churches being bombed. Um, I believe it was one New Year's Eve, I forget which year, but there were Christians killed when their church was bombed. Um, and following the fall of Mohammed Morsi, Islamists took revenge by attacking some 47 churches. Um, Sisi, on surface, is a much more secular figure, from what I can tell, but he should really be making sure that there is rule of law here. I know he's got a lot on his plate, but this is a very, very critical issue, and it was one of the fundamental concerns around the unrest that followed the Arab Spring about the protection for religious minorities. Now, if I was Mohammed Morsi, I would be ordering an immediate probe into this case, and not just a wider issue, specifically this case, to show that he's being serious about it. And I would be demanding the sacking of police officers in that area for not doing their job. As for the cards, these barbarian cards who done this to this woman, um, all I could say is it's. I mean, words aren't going to make a difference. Obviously, I can call them all the names under the sun. It isn't going to make a difference. But let's just say I have deep, deep contempt for such absolute scumbags. Basically, to put it absolutely bluntly, that's what I feel about. Um, on the group British Muslims for Secular Democracy, which I frequently contribute to, they'd reported this, and there were many people outright denouncing it. So there is a plurality of opinion within the Muslim world. Of course, there is, and there are liberal, secular, and moderate Muslims who absolutely on unmittingly condemn such incidents from happening. And I was pleased to see that. In fact, I saw one lady who said that she was boiling with rage. This was a Muslim woman who was saying this. because she recognised this was appalling. Um, Obviously, this is I've never had time for this attitude that, oh, you marry or you elope outside your own, then you should be killed. Goodness knows what they've done with the girl. The young man has had to flee for his life. For what? For what crime? For being in love. That's his crime. It's barbaric. Um, Now I'm going to get to the point. So that's the human rights part of the video. Blatantly, it's a violation of this woman's human rights and the young man's human rights and the young woman's human rights. And it comes into the human rights of minorities in Egypt in general. Now I'm going to get into the other issue, which comes down to political correctness, and that is to say that it is a fact. It is a fact that there are far too many examples of this sort of thing happening in Islamic majority countries in a way that do not happen in Christian countries, Christian majority countries. There is simply no rational comparison between isolated incidents of Muslims being abused in Western countries and institutional bigotry and discrimination and outright persecution of minorities in Islamic countries. There's no comparison. Why? This is why. When there are incidents of Muslims being attacked by racist morons in the West, and those incidents do happen, I've heard the reports of Muslim women having hijabs ripped off on the London Underground and so on. When those things happen, they are widely condemned, and we have very strict laws in place that treat that as hate crime, and the perpetrators are almost always arrested and punished, and rightly so. Now, in Islamic countries, when these sort of situations happen, well, that just proves it. There is police apathy. So governments will talk tough. You'll hear governments like, for example, in Pakistan saying, "Oh, we respect the rights of minorities and we have rules against persecution." You see, the thing about rules and laws, that's all very well, but they have to be enforced. That is the point. It's no good having laws if they're not enforced. So this is especially the case in Pakistan. The Pakistani government always makes excuses when there is appalling situations that amount to outright mass slaughter, like we saw in the horror earlier this year. Um, the excuse is always, I remember seeing the Pakistani ambassador interviewed on, I believe it was Newsnight. It's always the same excuses. Oh, you're picking on Pakistan. This is damaging Pakistan's reputation. We do have laws to control this. Frankly, they're not good enough. Unless you enforce those laws, it's not enough. And I know the Pakistani government is not in an easy position because they're going to be threatened by the Islamists if they do crack down hard. But in the end of the day, they're the government. Their responsibility is to protect all Pakistanis. And, you know, government is difficult. It is difficult. But that is their job. That's what they have to do. So, yeah, the Islamists will then threaten them. But that's their responsibility is to protect all Pakistani people. And it's one thing having laws. If those laws are not enforced at local level, it's not enough. They should be pushing for legislation that says either you act on this or people are going to lose their jobs, i.e., police commissioners or whatever the name is there. Um, this has to be taken seriously. And there are countless examples across the Islamic world of minorities being persecuted. This is absolutely endemic, and that is irrefutable. It's irrefutable. You get all the time similar situations happening, and it it really annoys me when Muslims talk about the West persecuting. This is nonsense. There is no systematic institutional persecution of Muslims in the West. It just isn't. And governments prevent programs to try and stop young people becoming Islamists does not count as persecution. I think it is common sense that governments need to take measures in order to stop radicalization and prevent terrorism. It's one of their main, if not their main remit, to protect their nationals, to keep the security of the nation. That is their remit. So you cannot say that the police questioning Muslim citizens about what they know about a fellow Muslim, that is not persecution. That is common sense. If Muslims are being refused entry into businesses, etc., that's discriminatory. That's wrong. But there is simply no comparison between anything happening in Western Europe and the Islamic world. The United States may be slightly different. I just read a report about Texas where there's armed vigilante groups dipping their bullets into pig blood so that they can send Muslims to hell. Now, they're outright fanatics, there's no question about it. And they're no better than the Islamists that they're going to kill. But in the case of Western Europe, there's just no comparison. So it really annoys me when people try to make out this victimhood agenda that just isn't there. Because yes, those incidents happen, but the point is they're taken very seriously. Um, Whereas in most Islamic countries, it is endemic. It's institutionalized. This is totally, totally factual. The people will point to history and they'll say, oh, but look at these situations where, for example, in parts of the Ottoman Empire and certain sultanates and so on, you had a situation where there was religious tolerance and the particular caliph or sultan at that time did exercise a policy of religious tolerance and minorities were protected and churches and synagogues thrived. Wonderful, great. But that's history we're talking about. What really matters is what's going on in the world today. So it's not a case of saying Islam is 100% intolerant. That wouldn't be true. However, Islam has a very serious problem with tolerance within. That is absolutely true. It's a fact. It's an absolute fact. And it's endemic across the Muslim world. Now, it varies. So, for example, the situation is not so bad in Indonesia, in Malaysia, which could be deemed to be more moderate Muslim countries because you don't quite get the same level of persecution of minorities. In fact, it's not comparable at all to a country like Pakistan and increasingly Bangladesh. What's happening in Bangladesh is awful. And by the way, it isn't just about non Muslim minorities, it's also about moderate Muslims and Muslim minority sects. They're targeted just as much. In Bangladesh, there have been at least 20 incidents this year of intellectuals, scholars, or anyone criticizing Islam being brutally hacked to death. Now, the good thing is in Bangladesh there has been strong protests against this, so um, there is a vocal portion of the population that will not accept this. They recognize it's going to hold Bangladesh back, and they're trying to do something about it. That's good. But this is a crisis situation. We're not talking about one attack. We're talking about at least 20 this year alone. So Bangladesh is sliding down a very dark path, and the government really, really needs to get a grip on this situation. Because wherever Islamists rear their ugly head, this happens. It goes hand in hand, and it's starting now to happen in Western European countries as well, where there is Islamist influence. For example, the sectarian killing in Glasgow not long ago, where an Ahmadi Muslim was killed simply because he wished his Christian neighbours a happy Christmas or it might have been Happy Easter. But the point is, he was murdered simply for displaying tolerance because he wanted to wish his neighbours well. Now, what sort of sick mindset would kill a man in cold blood for wishing people of another faith well? Imagine if I wish Muslims a happy Ramadan and some Christian fundamentalist was to murder me as a result of that. That's basically what we're talking about. Not that I'm a Christian, but I'm from a Christian background. And that's the point I'm talking about. It sickens me that this is so widespread, and instead of just condemning it and trying to do something about it, so many Muslims in these countries are constantly whinging about how awful the West is in persecuting Muslims. This is dishonest. This is knowingly dishonest. Or either that or they're being fed the wrong propaganda. But the point is, there's no comparison whatsoever. They should have a look at their backyard, do something about it. If they don't want to be seen as terrorists and extremists, then prove that stereotype wrong and do something about it. Go out to the streets of Cairo and protest in favour of minorities. It disgusts me that there's so many excuses made for this, and people basically turn a blind eye. What this poor woman went through must have been horrendous. And this does relate to political correctness because there's still too many on the left in Western Europe who stubbornly will not call a spade a spade. They will not accept this as a problem that is exceptionally high in Islamic countries. Now, yes, you get examples in other parts of the world where Muslims are genuinely persecuted. The situation in Burma, for example. But there is still hypocrisy here because instead of focusing on the plight of the Rohingya people, they're a Muslim minority in Burma and they do get a pretty terrible time. I mean, they're one of the world's most persecuted groups. But instead of focusing on that, people in Pakistan and Iran and other Islamic countries focus on the Palestinians. So there's double standards in terms of what they prioritize as, you know, as an issue. Um, in India, there have been examples of anti-Muslim pogroms. A lot of innocent Muslims have been killed by Hindu fanatics. And it comes down to the point that you get extremists in every religion. That's absolutely true. India, I believe, does have a serious problem with fanatical Hindu nationalists. And they're just as anti-human and as barbaric in their actions as Islamists. They're no better. That's true. The difference is, though, that it is restrained to within India. They generally don't export this fanaticism. Islamism, pan-Islamism is a global problem, and that goes without question. Wherever you get an Islamist government in place, you get a strong likelihood or de facto discrimination institutionalized of minorities. This is a fact. And quoting historical examples of tolerance has no relevance to what's happening today. The fact of the matter is, there's very, very few examples of Muslim majority countries where minorities are not persecuted. Saudi Arabia has just enacted legislation to make it a crime punishable by death to be an atheist. This is utterly barbaric. I still maintain we seriously need to review our ties with Saudi Arabia. As far as I'm concerned, it's a complete disgrace of a country. I rarely make blanket statements about countries, but to be honest, Saudi Arabia, I don't lose much sleep over saying that. The only people I would be concerned about is liberal Saudis like Raif Badawi or moderate Saudis who recognise that their government is insane and is a fanatical, theocratic dictatorship. Um, they can build these gleaming skyscrapers, they can have world class healthcare, but in the end of the day, they have a barbaric attitude to minorities and a horrendous human rights record. This is just a fact. So the reason I mention the political correctness is there are left wingers, predominantly in the West, who will still say, "Oh, but you can't talk about that. Every religion has extremists," and they make it this kind of vague, neutral statement. There is no moral equivalency here because this is a problem that is exceptionally endemic in the Islamic world. Yes, you get examples of Hindu, Buddhist, and Christian fanatics. I'm not disputing that. But what I would contend is it is not as widespread, it is not as exported, and you just don't get it on a comparable basis. I mean, you do get examples, for example, in Africa, of Christian fanaticism insofar as the way homosexuals are treated in countries like Uganda, and very often there it's Christian dogma that is used to defend it. It's equally abhorrent, but I still believe that there is an institutional bigotry and persecution that you find in the Islamic world that goes above. And another difference here is the reality of Islamist terrorist groups. You get Christian, Hindu, and Buddhist fanatics, but in terms of actual terrorist groups, specifically acting for ideological terrorism, then yeah, pretty much every major group is Islamist in its ideology. Let's have a look. You have Islamic State. You have the Taliban, both the Afghan and Pakistani version. You have Al Shabaab. Ansar Dine, I think, has fizzled out, thank goodness, when it was operating in the Central African Republic. Um, or West Africa, I should say. But the list goes on and on and on. Hezbollah, Hamas, the list goes on. Where you get other groups operating, they tend to be localized. So, for example, you get the Naxalites and the Maoists in India. It tends to be a localized situation. You get the Mexican drug cartels. Okay, they do operate outside Mexican borders, but it is still very much Mexico centric. With pan Islamism, nowhere is safe because their stated goal is to spread a caliphate. So, what I'm saying here is basically fact. And what I would say to people in these countries is the next time you want to preach about the West persecuting Muslims, I would suggest you look at the source. And I would suggest that you take a long, hard look at your backyard before pointing fingers at the West, because there's no comparison. We have strict laws protecting everyone from discrimination. And if a Muslim is harassed, if they're violently attacked, the perpetrator will be arrested and punished, I guarantee you. But when these sort of examples, I mean, put it this way, 300 men. We're not talking about a few individuals who dragged her into a back alley. This was in public at daytime, tolerated by the police. Disgusting, barbaric, cowardly. So, I hope Sisi does something about this. It's his jurisdiction as Egyptian president to protect all Egyptians.